Orion Shadowstep was standing on the jagged obsidian edge of the Shadow Realm when the atmosphere shifted. For a century, he had lived in the silence of the void, but he knew the sound of a soul breaking. It wasn't just a scream, it was a sonic flare of solar agony, ancient and desperate, that tore through the supernatural veil like a comet. It came from the Ravine of Lost Souls, the star-crossed pack's dumping ground for their shamed and their broken. Technically, it was a neutral zone, a graveyard for those meant to be forgotten. But the heat of that sound was a trespass Orion couldn't ignore. He looked up into the swirling mists just as a streak of white light plummeted. It was Phoenix, Nix, her small frame cast out like refuse, falling into a darkness that had swallowed gods. A fall from that height into the abyssal jagged rocks below was a death sentence. No Omega survived the ravine, no one. His shadow wolf roared within him, demanding he intervene. This was star-crossed business, a political mess he had no stake in. But the sheer wrongness of that light being snuffed out by the dark made him move. He didn't just run, he became the shadow itself, a blur of dark matter racing against gravity. He didn't wait to find a corpse on the rocks. Defying the laws of the physical world, Orion lunged from the cliffside, catching her mid-air. The impact of her body against his chest wasn't cold like a dying wolf. It was like holding a miniature sun. He landed on the ravine floor, the shadows cushioning their descent. He expected her to be limp, a broken shell. Instead, her fingers clawed into his dark tunic with a strength that defied her Omega status. When Nix's eyes snapped open, glowing not with the dull brown of a common wolf, but with a blinding molten gold, Orion felt a shockwave of celestial resonance ripple through his very soul. She wasn't a girl to be silenced. She was a star that had survived the fall. The sky over the star-crossed territory wasn't dark yet, but for Nix, the sun had already set. She had followed Apollo to the edge of the Ravine of Lost Souls because he had promised her a private ceremony, a blood binding that would finally silence the whispers of her being a broken Omega. She had loved him with the naive purity of a girl who believed her fated mate was her sanctuary. Even now, standing on the crumbling limestone lip of the abyss, she reached for his hand, seeking warmth. But Apollo's hand was cold, his grip tightening with a clinical, detached strength. From the shadows of a gnarled cedar tree, Hera Black stepped forward. She wasn't wearing the face of a best friend. Her expression was sharpened by a cruel triumph, her hand resting possessively on the swell of her stomach. The scent of Apollo's musk was all over her, a pheromonal betrayal that hit Nix harder than any physical blow. "She knows too much, Apollo," Hera whispered, her voice like silk over a razor. "She saw the crates, she saw the sigils of the underworld. If the Council finds out we've been trading pack secrets to Hades for power, we won't just be exiled, we'll be executed." Nix looked at Apollo, her heart stuttering. "Apollo, please, I didn't tell anyone, I wouldn't. You're my mate." Apollo finally looked at her, but there was no resonance in his gaze, only the calculating stare of a man protecting his throne. "You were never my mate, Phoenix. You were a mistake the moon goddess made, a defect in the bloodline." He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "The silence of the grave is the only way to ensure our future. You're an Omega. The world will just think you couldn't handle the pressure of the shift and jumped." Hera's laughter was a jagged sound in the thin mountain air. Together they moved with a synchronized cruelty. Nix tried to shift, to find the wolf that had been suppressed for 18 years, but there was only a flicker of heat, a spark that died as soon as it was born. Apollo's hands landed on her shoulders, and with one violent, decisive heave, he erased her from his life. The wind didn't scream as she fell. Nix did. It was a sound of absolute rupture, the shattering of a soul that had been lied to since birth. As the mist swallowed her and the jagged obsidian teeth of the ravine rose to meet her, the last thing she saw was the two of them standing at the top, silhouetted against a dying sun, watching her disappear into the silence. She was a secret being buried, a nuisance being discarded. But as the darkness closed in, the cold didn't take her. Instead, the void began to ripple, and the shadows below started to reach back. The transition from the screaming wind to the absolute silence of the ebon citadel was a violent sort of peace. When Nix finally opened her eyes, she didn't find the grey mists of the ravine or the jagged rocks of her expected grave. Instead, she was staring at a ceiling of polished obsidian that seemed to swallow the very light it reflected. The air was cool, smelling of ancient stone and cedar, a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of her own terror. She tried to sit up, but a gasp of pure agony caught in her throat. Her ribs felt as though they had been fused back together by lightning, and her skin hummed with a strange, vibrating heat. "Don't move," a voice commanded. It was deep, vibrating through the floorboards and into her bones like the low roll of thunder. Nix turned her head slowly, finding a man's silhouette against a massive arched window that looked out over a kingdom of permanent twilight. Orion Shadowstep stepped into the dim light of the hearth, his presence so massive it seemed to bend the shadows of the room toward him. He wasn't the monster the stories described. He was something far more terrifying, a king who looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen the beginning and end of worlds. "You should be dead," Orion said, his gaze tracking the shallow, ragged rise of her chest. "The Ravine of Lost Souls does not offer second chances. And yet, when I caught you, you weren't cold. You were burning." "I'm an Omega," Nix whispered, her voice sounding like dry parchment. "I'm broken. My own mate. He said I was a defect." Orion moved with a predatory grace that was almost too fast for her eyes to follow. He reached the side of her bed in a single stride and took her hand. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. He picked up a small silver lancet from a velvet tray and, before she could flinch, made a tiny, precise nick on the pad of her thumb. "Watch," he murmured. Nix looked down, expecting the dull crimson blood of a weak wolf. Instead, a thick, luminous droplet welled up from the cut. It didn't smear. It glowed. It was a brilliant, shimmering molten gold, radiating a warmth that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. It looked like liquid sunlight, captured in a vessel of flesh. "Omegas bleed red, Nix," Orion said, his electric blue eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "Common alphas bleed red, but this is the ichor of the solar phoenix. You aren't a defect of the star-crossed pack. You are the very thing they spent 18 years trying to extinguish." He let go of her hand, but the resonance of his touch remained, a dark shadow meeting a golden flame. "You woke up in the house of the Shadow King because I am the only one strong enough to keep you from burning the world down before you learn how to rule it. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 3, where Nix discovers the truth about her poisoning and begins her transformation? The air in the lower vaults of the ebon citadel was thick with the scent of ozone and sulfur. In the center of the room, bound by silver chains that hummed with Orion's dark energy, sat Dr. Chiron. The man was a shadow of his former self, his scholarly poise stripped away to reveal a trembling coward. He had been the star-crossed pack's most trusted physician, the man who had checked Nix's vitals every month for 18 years, always shaking his head with a pitying sigh at her failed development. "The seals, Chiron," Orion growled, his voice vibrating the stone walls. He stood behind Nix, a hand resting on her shoulder, not just to ground her, but to contain the heat already beginning to radiate from her skin. "Tell her what you did under the guise of medicine." Chiron looked up, his eyes wide with the terror of a man facing a god. "It wasn't just me. Apollo's father. They were afraid. A solar phoenix hasn't been born in a millennia." Their power makes alphas look like lapdogs. I used the Wolf's Bane alchemical, the lead seal. Every vitamin injection I gave her was a liquid shackle designed to petrify her core. We weren't treating a defect. We were building a cage. Nix felt a cold, sharp rage pierce through the fog of her recovery. Every moment of shame, every time she had been called a burden, had been manufactured by the very man who claimed to be her healer. "How do I break it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the gold, beginning to flicker in the whites of her eyes. "You don't just break a lead seal," Chiron whispered. "You have to burn it out. It's the trial of the sun. If your spirit isn't strong enough to endure the heat of your own blood, you'll incinerate from the inside out." Orion turned her to face him. "He's right. This is a demolition of your current self. It will feel like dying twice. Do you want to remain the broken girl they threw away, or do you want to be the fire that hunts them?" Nix didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the stone dais in the center of the vault. As she sat, she reached deep within, searching for that spark Apollo had tried to crush. She found it, a tiny trapped ember beneath layers of leaden ice. She gripped it with her mind and pulled. The scream that left her throat was no longer human. It was a bird of prey, a celestial roar. White-hot light erupted from her pores, turning her gold-flecked blood into a literal furnace. The alchemical seals shattered like glass in a forge, and for the first time in 18 years, the sun inside Nix Callisto finally began to rise. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 4, where Nix undergoes her brutal combat training as her wolf begins to surface? The transformation was not a graceful unfurling. It was a violent excavation. For 6 days and 6 nights, Nix remained suspended in the heart of the Ebon Citadel's inner sanctum. Her body, a battlefield where the leaden alchemical poisons fought against the rising tide of her true nature. Orion watched from the shadows, his own dark power acting as a containment field, keeping the sheer intensity of her heat from melting the stone foundations of his home. He saw the way her skin glowed with an internal light, her veins mapping out like golden rivers beneath a porcelain surface. On the dawn of the 7th day, the rebirth reached its terrifying zenith. Nix's heart, which had been slowed by Chiron's toxins for nearly 2 decades, gave a thunderous, singular kick. A shockwave of pure solar energy erupted from her core, shattering the remaining spectral shackles that bound her soul. The scream that tore from her lungs was no longer a plea for mercy. It was a war cry that resonated through the physical and spiritual planes alike. As the golden fire washed over her, the dark tresses of her hair began to change, the pigment burning away until her locks were strands of living, dancing flame, brilliant orange and searing white gold that didn't consume her flesh but seemed to feed on the very air around her. Her eyes snapped open, the irises now twin suns of molten intensity. In that moment of absolute clarity, Nix didn't just feel her power. She felt the world's reaction to it. Far to the south, in the deepest pits of the underworld, she felt a sudden, sharp tremor of fear. Hades. The name vibrated in her mind like a discordant chord. Through the link of her newly awakened senses, she realized why the ancient villain had conspired with Apollo to keep her buried in the ash of an Omega identity. Shadows could survive a guttering candle, and darkness could thrive against a moonlit night, but nothing in the abyss could withstand the raw, purifying light of a solar phoenix. She wasn't just a survivor of the ravine. She was the cosmic predator of the very darkness that sought to claim the world. Orion stepped forward, the heat of the room singeing the edges of his cloak, but he didn't flinch. He looked at the radiant warrior standing where a broken girl had once lain and gave a slow, grim nod of approval. The phoenix had risen, and for the first time in an eternity, the Shadow King saw a light bright enough to lead his armies into the coming war. The silence of her grave had been replaced by a roar that would soon reach the ears of those who had dared to throw her away. The grand hall of the Valorian summit was a cathedral of excess, draped in celestial silks and lit by floating orbs of moonstone. To the gathered alphas and high-ranking dignitaries, it was a night of political posturing. To Nix, it was a masquerade in the lion's den. Dressed in a gown of midnight velvet that seemed to absorb the light around her, and wearing a delicate obsidian mask that obscured her features, she moved through the crowd like a phantom. Behind her, Orion Shadowstep walked with the heavy, silent authority of a storm cloud, his presence ensuring that no one dared look too closely at the woman on his arm. From the shadows of a marble pillar, Nix watched as Apollo Caine took the central dais. Beside him, Hera Black stood in a gown of shimmering silver, her hand resting with practiced grief over her heart. Apollo looked every bit the tragic hero, his voice booming with a carefully rehearsed tremor that made Nix's skin crawl with the memory of the ravine. "Tonight, we gather under a shroud of sorrow," Apollo announced, his gaze sweeping over the audience with a charismatic lie. "As many of you know, the star-crossed pack has suffered a devastating loss. My fated mate, Nix Callisto, succumbed to the instability of her own spirit. She was unable to survive the Ravine of Lost Souls. We mourn the girl who was too fragile for this world, even as we look toward a future where our bloodline remains pure and strong." Nix felt the heat in her veins begin to churn, a low hum of solar fire that vibrated against the floorboards. She watched the way Hera smirked behind her silk fan, the way the other alphas bowed their heads in a performance of sympathy for a man who was a murderer. Apollo was already pivoting his speech toward the necessity of new alliances. Specifically, the dark treaties he was finalizing with the agents of Hades. He was selling her death as a political cornerstone, building his throne on the lie of her weakness. "Let him speak." Orion's voice was a low vibration in her ear, his hand firm on her elbow to keep her light from erupting prematurely. The higher he builds his pedestal, the further he has to fall. Nix tightened her grip on her champagne flute until the glass hairline fractured under the pressure of her heat. She watched Apollo raise a toast to her memory, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who thought he had buried his greatest threat. She didn't reveal herself yet. She waited, letting the embers of her rage refine into a diamond-sharp focus. She was no longer the fragile girl he described. She was the sun waiting for the horizon, and when she finally rose, she wouldn't just shatter his speech, she would incinerate his world. The journey back to the edges of the star-crossed territory was a descent into a wasteland Nix hardly recognized. The lush valleys of her childhood had been replaced by a landscape that looked as though it had been drained of its very soul. Trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their leaves turned to ash, and the rivers ran thick with a sluggish, oily blackness. This was the scorched earth, the physical manifestation of a pack leader who had sold the land's vitality to pay a debt to the underworld. Orion knelt by a dry creek bed, his fingers brushing over a series of scorched, ritualistic runes carved into the parched earth. "These aren't just border markings," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "This is a siphon, a harvester." Nix stepped closer, her own internal heat flaring in protest against the cold, dead energy of the site. Beside the runes lay a pile of discarded belongings, a child's toy, a shredded pack tunic, a rusted locket. There were no bodies, only the lingering scent of ozone and the heavy sulphurous stench of Hades' shadow wraiths. "Where are they, Orion?" she asked, her eyes glowing with a flickering orange light that cast long shadows across the blighted ground. "They aren't dead in the way your people understand death," Orion replied, standing up and looking toward the blackened spires of the star-crossed citadel in the distance. "Apollo isn't just killing them, he's offering their life force as a tribute. Look at the way he appeared at the gala, untouched by time, his aura unnaturally vibrant while his people starve. He's trading the longevity of the pack for his own eternal youth. The realization hit Nix with the force of a physical blow. Apollo hadn't just thrown her into the ravine to hide his secrets. He had transformed their entire home into a sacrificial altar. Every day he reigned was another day the soul of the pack was bled dry to feed the vanity of a coward and the hunger of a god. The land was screaming, a silent subterranean vibration that only a solar phoenix could hear. She reached out, touching a withered oak tree. A pulse of golden light moved from her fingertips into the wood, and for a fleeting second, the tree groaned as if trying to remember how to breathe before the corruption choked it back out. Nix pulled her hand away, her jaw set in a line of molten resolve. Apollo thought he had silenced her to protect his throne, but he had only succeeded in giving her a reason to burn it to the ground. She wasn't just coming back for revenge, she was coming to reclaim the life he had stolen from the earth itself. The mist at the lip of the Ravine of Lost Souls did not swirl with the wind today. It parted in reverence. Nix stood exactly where she had been shoved into the void, her boots crunching on the same limestone that had once felt like her tombstone. She was no longer draped in the midnight velvet of the gala or the rags of an omega. Her armor was woven of golden light and shadow silk, and her hair flowed like a river of contained magma down her back. Beside her, Orion Shadowstep remained a silent, looming presence, the darkness at his feet curling like a loyal beast. Hera Black was brought to the edge in chains of shimmering obsidian, her silver silk gown torn and stained with the soot of the scorched earth. She looked at the drop behind her, and then at the radiant woman before her, her eyes wide with a frantic, ugly terror. "Nix, please," she sobbed, the sound of her voice a pale imitation of the friendship they had once shared. "Apollo forced me. He said he would kill me if I didn't help. I'm pregnant, Nix. You wouldn't hurt a mother." Nix stepped forward, the heat radiating from her skin causing the air to shimmer. She didn't look at Hera with rage, but with a cold, terrifying neutrality. "You stood here and laughed while the man I loved broke my soul," Nix said, her voice echoing with the resonance of 1,000 suns. "You didn't just want his throne, Hera. You wanted to watch the light go out of my eyes because you couldn't stand that I was born with a spark you could never possess." Nix reached out, her fingers glowing white-hot. She didn't touch Hera's flesh. She touched the air an inch from her chest, where the spiritual bond of the pack resided. With a sharp, sudden twist of her wrist, Nix pulled. A scream of pure agony tore from Hera as the silver threads of her status, her connection to the star-crossed pack, and the protection of the moon were incinerated. The marks of the pack on Hera's neck faded into scarred, blackened flesh. "I am not a murderer, Hera. I will not throw you into the dark," Nix whispered, leaning in close enough for Hera to see the molten gold swirling in her irises. "But you are no longer of this pack. You are nameless. You are landless. You will wander the scorched earth you helped create, and you will see the faces of the families you sold to Hades in every shadow." Nix turned her back on the broken woman, the judgment rendered. She looked down into the ravine that should have been her grave and saw only a path upward. The silence of the ravine was finally broken, not by a scream, but by the roar of a queen reclaiming her domain. "Would you like me to proceed to Chapter 8, where the ancient villain Hades begins his final assault and the sky turns black?" The sun did not set that evening. It was extinguished. One moment, the horizon was stained with the bruised purples of twilight, and the next, a terrifying, unnatural ink bled across the sky, swallowing the stars. The air turned frigid, smelling of wet earth and ancient rot. Hades had finally breached the veil. From the cracks in the scorched earth, shadow wraiths began to pour forth, formless, shrieking horrors that feasted on the lingering hope of the star-crossed pack. Orion Shadowstep stood at the vanguard of the Citadel's battlements, his own dark power unfurling like a massive obsidian cloak. He met the darkness with darkness, his shadow tendrils lashing out to tear the wraiths apart. But as the breach widened, the sky didn't just turn black. It became heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs of every living thing. Orion, who had commanded the shadows for 2 centuries, suddenly felt a terrifying pull. His own power was being leached away, drawn toward the vortex of the underworld. The shadows he controlled were no longer his to command. They were being reclaimed by the progenitor of all darkness. Orion! Nix's voice cut through the freezing gale, her hair a flickering beacon of orange flame against the oppressive gloom. She saw him stumble, his form flickering as the wraith swarmed closer, sensing the weakening of the Shadow King. The very elements he had used to protect her were now betraying him, turning into shackles of cold despair. Orion looked back at her, his face pale, the electric blue of his eyes dimmed by the encroaching void. He realized then that his strength was a shield for the night, but this was a darkness that lived in the absence of all life. His shadows could only fight what they could see, and right now, the world was becoming nothing. "It's too much," he gritted out, his knees hitting the stone as a wraith's claw raked across his shoulder, leaving a trail of frost. "My shadows. They belong to him now." He looked up at Nix, the realization of their only path forward, etching itself into his features. "The moon is gone, Nix. The shadows are his. You are the only light left in this world that wasn't born from the earth. Burn it away. Don't just fight them. Replace the sky." Nix felt the weight of his words, the terrifying responsibility of the solar phoenix. She looked at the black moor above, at the man who had caught her when she was falling, and she let go of the last of her human restraint. She didn't just draw on her power, she became a sun in the heart of the abyss. The temperature on the battlements began to soar, the frost on Orion's cloak turning to steam. She was no longer just a girl or a wolf, she was a celestial event, and the war for the dawn had officially begun. The sky was no longer a void. It was a canvas of screaming shadows and dying light. Nix stood at the epicenter of the storm, her hair a wild halo of blinding white gold fire that lashed against the unnatural blackness. Before her stood the avatar of Hades, a towering construct of smoke and ancient malice, and beside it, Apollo Caine. Apollo looked small now, his youth finally failing him, as the dark god withdrew the borrowed vitality he had used as a bribe. His skin was graying, his eyes wide with the realization that he was nothing more than a discarded pawn in a game of cosmic proportions. "You were meant to stay in the dirt, Phoenix," Apollo hissed, though his voice shook. He lunged forward, fueled by a final desperate surge of Hades' power, his claws coated in a necrotizing frost. Nix didn't flinch. She met his charge not with a strike, but with an unfolding of her true self. A shockwave of pure solar radiation erupted from her, so intense that the shadow wraiths in the vicinity were vaporized instantly, turned to ash before they could even shriek. She caught Apollo by the throat, her hand glowing with the heat of a localized star. The necrotizing frost on his skin evaporated in a hiss of steam. "I didn't stay in the dirt because I was born from the fire," Nix said, her voice a chorus of celestial power. "You traded your people's souls for a throne you never deserved. For that, there is no silence. There is only justice." With a thought, she channeled the full weight of the solar phoenix into her palm. Apollo didn't have time to scream, as her fire cauterized his very existence, burning away the treasonous heart and the stolen youth until only a handful of white ash remained to be scattered by the gale. She turned her gaze to the vortex in the sky, to Hades himself. The dark god let out a roar of frustration as Nix ascended, her feet leaving the stone battlements. She spread her arms, and from her back, wings of living flame unfurled, spanning the width of the citadel. She wasn't just fighting the darkness, she was rewriting the atmosphere. With a blinding flash that could be seen for 1,000 miles, Nix detonated her light, a supernova of purifying energy that tore the underworld breach apart. The black ink of the sky shattered, falling away like broken glass to reveal a dawn that had been absent for a generation. As the first true rays of the sun hit the scorched earth, the land gave a collective shudder of relief. Nix descended slowly, her feet touching the ground in front of the great hall. Orion Shadowstep stood there, his shadows finally settling into a peaceful rhythm at his feet. He bowed his head, followed by the survivors of the star-crossed pack who had watched their Omega save the world. Nix stood before the throne, the fire in her hair settling into a steady royal glow. She was no longer the girl they threw into the ravine. She was the Solar Queen, and the long night was finally over. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a sequel or a bonus epilogue for the Solar Queen and the Shadow King?